In the kingdom's darkest hour, a legendary weapon was unveiled. The hero's sword, forged in fire and magic, awaited the one warrior capable of wielding it and turning the tide of the war. But a woman facepalms when someone says it just looks like any old sword. She starts explaining that the weapon is forged from the legendary metal called orichalcum. On top of that, it's light for its wielder, but its strikes are 10 times stronger and even nullify healing. She says that's not even half of what the sword can do and reveals who created it. Turns out, the creator was her childhood friend, Bill Bark, the same kid she used to beat up when they were little. Bill shows up all embarrassed, saying he just wants world peace with his skills. The hero takes the sword impressed, since not even the royal blacksmiths use this metal. However, Bill says the weapon is only good if the user knows how to unlock its full potential. The hero approaches, placing a hand on Bill's shoulder, and he promises to make Bill the greatest blacksmith on the entire continent. Hearing this promise, our main character gets completely starry-eyed and filled with hope. The hero shone brightly, like a divine and inspiring figure to Bill. Bill thanks him, feeling awkward and seeing himself as just a simple blacksmith from the countryside. In the end, he sees himself as just a side character but is happy if his skills can be of help. Right after, Bill calls his friend Sepia over for a chat. He shows her a ring he made while working on the hero's sword. Stuttering, Bill says the ring is made of orichalcum and would look good on her. Bill then tries to confess his feelings to her but gets all tongue-tied. In the end, he just asks her to accept the ring as a gift. However, Sepia holds his hand before he can give it to her. She asks Bill to give her the ring only after the Demon King is defeated. Hearing this, our MC is confused by her response. Despite that, he forces a smile and agrees to her request. Bill then clenches his fist because he understood what she really meant by that. The truth is, he already knew Sepia loved the hero but decided to shoot his shot anyway, because she would be going far away with the hero, to a place he could never reach. With a sad smile, Bill accepts his fate. He just wishes for his friend to be very happy alongside the hero. 4 years go by, and someone shouts that the hero's party has finally defeated the great evil. 4 years later, Bill is in the forge while his uncle asks what good saving the world did. The apprentice complains that they can't pay the taxes, and the forge will be seized. Annoyed by the comment, the uncle throws a bottle at the rookie. He then yells that it's the Empire's fault for only investing in the large, state-run workshops. Bill then asks his uncle to stop complaining, as the government must have its reasons. Besides, he says just knowing he helped the hero makes him feel very proud. The apprentice scoffs, saying the hero is now called the Lord Protector of the Empire. The uncle feels guilty and says if Bill hadn't taken over the family business, he'd be better off. However, Bill insists it was his choice and that he'll find a way to make money. Soon, they put out the fire, as the curfew imposed by the hero is approaching. Night falls, and the forge grows silent in the darkness of the isolated forest. The next day, our MC walks alone through the city carrying a small case. He thinks his repair service was a good idea, but hears shouting coming from the street. It turns out a crowd of merchants is protesting for their rights. Not understanding a thing, Bill asks someone what's going on. The guy explains that the Empire will now only do business with large guilds, and that's why chaos has erupted. Because of this, the soldiers are containing the crowd, and Bill thanks him for the explanation. Still, our protagonist thinks they're fools because protesting won't solve anything. He even thinks they don't value their own lives and worries about their families. Finding the situation pathetic, Bill turns to leave since it's not his problem. However, something catches his attention, and he looks back into the middle of all the commotion. His expression changes completely when he sees someone he knows very well there. Turns out his Uncle Phil is in the middle of the protesters, shouting for merchants' rights. Completely shocked, Bill wonders what his uncle is doing in the middle of that protest. The uncle also notices his presence and is surprised to see Bill in the middle of the street. Suddenly, a knight shouts that by order of the Lord Protector, they are going to take action. Martial law is declared on the spot, and he orders the squad to raise their spears. All the soldiers point their weapons forward, preparing to advance. Immediately after, the commander gives the order to attack, and the soldiers charge at the people. Without a second thought, the knights begin to attack the unarmed protesters. Amid the chaos, people run in desperation and Bill is paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, a spray of blood whizzes past our protagonist's face. Realizing what happened, he lets out a scream of pure terror, his face now stained. His Uncle Phil, seeing the scene, shouts desperately for Bill to run as fast as possible. However, our MC finally snaps out of it and grabs his relative's arm. Bill then starts pulling his uncle, saying he knows a shortcut for them to escape. The two of them run through a narrow alley, trying to flee the chaos and the guards. But the soldiers don't give up and chase them, shouting not to let anyone escape. One of the knights is ordered to attack with full force if necessary. Without hesitation, he runs through one of the civilians trying to escape the Empire's soldiers. Bill keeps running, out of breath and tired, but he doesn't let go of his case for anything. He pushes forward through the dark alley while being closely pursued by the Imperial guards. At that moment, a memory of his father comes to his mind about his first time in the forge. As he runs, the scenery around him begins to transform completely. The alley turns into a map of blue lines, as if he were analyzing every detail. The structure of the alley reveals itself to Bill like a detailed architectural blueprint. His eyes glow with a blue light, and he realizes he's the only one who sees the world this way. This is an ability that no one else possesses, and it might be his only salvation. With a determined look, he quickly searches for an escape route for his group. Suddenly, a wall glows red, showing a weak point in the structure. Without a second thought, our protagonist grabs a hammer from his case. He then delivers a precise strike to the wall, opening a passage to the other side. Everyone goes through the hole while one of the fugitives looks back, confused. The hole in the wooden wall is smoldering as if something were burning. The soldiers continue the chase, shouting to execute all the traitors. Bill looks back, worried, as the chase isn't over yet and they're still in danger. The knights yell for the rebels to stop immediately, or they will suffer the consequences. Ignoring the warnings, our protagonist starts a countdown in his mind. One furious soldier yells that they will all pay dearly for their crimes. However, the hole in the wall begins to crumble as if it were made of sand. The count reaches 2, and the wall starts to crack even more around the hole. Soon after, the number 1 appears in his mind, and the entire structure becomes unstable. At 0, the wall begins to collapse completely into several pieces. And so, the wooden structure comes crashing down on the soldiers who were passing through. The knights are left completely lost, not understanding what just happened. Meanwhile, Bill and the others take the opportunity to escape amidst all the dust. They finally manage to reach the safety of the forge, which is hidden in the forest. Inside, Bill is in shock, repeating over and over what happened in the city. He falls to the ground in despair while his uncle Phil apologizes for what happened. Phil tells him to calm down and asks Bill to explain what he did to save them. But our protagonist, still in shock, asks what that ability was. The uncle says he doesn't know the details, but the Empire's reaction was way over the top. He then says that Bill must have felt how the government crushes the weak. With his hands on the ground, Bill begs his uncle to never get involved in protests again. But Phil questions what will happen to the country if everyone gives up fighting. Kneeling on the floor, Bill says the country is the Lord Protector's problem, not his uncle's. He confesses that he's scared because his parents never came back from the war, and he lost Sepia. Phil listens in silence as Bill says he works hard so they don't lose the forge. Crying, Bill asks what he would do if he lost him too, because he couldn't bear it. Moved by his words, the uncle touches his head and apologizes for everything. He then hugs Bill, promising that from now on he won't have any more worries. Phil announces to the others that he is leaving the movement, and they understand his decision. Following his example, the others also give up, as they don't want to risk their lives. After all the tension, a moment of peace finally arrives with a clear sky. The next day, all the fugitives are sleeping peacefully in the forge. Our protagonist then starts to wake up slowly after a hectic night. He opens his eyes, still a bit sleepy from everything that happened recently. Beside him, his uncle also wakes up and apologizes once more for the scare he gave him. Bill is relieved and promises that his uncle won't have to worry about the forge anymore. Finally, he lies back down, thinking that things have finally returned to normal. But the peace is short-lived, as the forge door is kicked open with a violent blow. Immediately after, the Empire's soldiers storm the place, and the commander orders everyone to be arrested. Bill is apprehended and accused of treason against the state, leaving him completely shocked. Everyone is tied up and taken outside while our protagonist doesn't understand a thing. He finds it all very strange, because they should have been attacked during the night. Besides, the place is isolated, so Bill wonders how the soldiers found them. Suddenly, one of the fugitives yells that this wasn't what they had agreed on. It was Tom, who defends his master, saying that Bill never participated in the protests. As everyone is being led away, our protagonist finally understands what happened. He glares at his apprentice Tom, and realizes he was betrayed by the one he trusted most. Tom is desperate and can't even look his master in the eye out of sheer shame. With his hands tied, Bill asks in a low voice the reason for the betrayal. He then screams with all his might, asking why Tom sold them all out. The apprentice explains that they promised they wouldn't take Bill under any circumstances. It turns out the soldiers said that Uncle Phil was completely useless to them. Crying, Tom says the forge was going to be taken, and Uncle Phil just drank and went to protests. Furthermore, the government offered a reward for anyone who reported those involved. So, he thought that with the uncle out of the way, the forge could start over from scratch. In the end, he just turns away and apologizes to his master for the whole betrayal. Sometime later, trumpets announce the arrival of someone very important, and we see that our protagonist has been taken to the Empire's throne room. Bill is all cleaned up and trembling with fear as the Lord calls him comrade. It turns out the Lord Protector is the hero, Oliver Prime, who tells him to calm down. Our protagonist feels awkward and says it's kind of hard to get comfortable there. So Oliver gets straight to the point and asks if he joined the people's movement. Bill panics and falls to the floor, saying he's a huge admirer of the hero. Oliver laughs and says that nowadays, Bill is the only one who still calls him that. He reveals that he already knows Bill is innocent, because a witness confirmed everything. Our protagonist is greatly relieved and wonders who it was that helped him. Finally, Oliver says he paid off the forge's debts and Bill is left speechless. Oliver says it was nothing, as it's a favor for the man who saved humanity. In the crowd, a man asks who Bill is to be treated like that by the Lord Protector. His friend then starts talking about the 3 great master blacksmiths of the world. Besides the Cyclops of the demon realm, there is also Vulcanus from the kingdom of Aveline. And finally, we have the golden hand of the Voltern Empire, known as Midas. He then reveals that the greatest of them all is Bill Bark, the Midas who forged the hero's sword. The other man doubts it, as there are more than 20 masters in that kingdom alone. But his friend explains that Bill is modest, but everyone knows he's the best. Our protagonist then musters the courage and decides to ask the hero a question. Oliver smiles and tells him to ask whatever he wants, no problem at all. Bill then says he lost contact with Sepia and wanted to know about her. Upon hearing the girl's name, Oliver's hand clenches tightly on the arm of the throne. Even so, he says she's on a mission and will return to the forge later. Our protagonist is overjoyed and thanks the hero for the great news. Finally, Bill says he has just one last thing to talk to Oliver about. A little embarrassed, Bill asks if his uncle can come home with him. Oliver then, with a serious look, asks what would happen if it were already too late. Our protagonist is shocked, not understanding what he meant by that. Suddenly, the hero starts laughing, saying it was just a bad joke. Bill remains confused by the joke while the entire court laughs along with Oliver. But the Lord Protector soon gets serious and says it was a mistake to try and make a joke. He explains that Bill's innocence was proven, but his uncle's has not been yet. So Oliver apologizes and says he'll see what can be done for now. Our protagonist is very grateful because the hero promised he would help in some way. To Bill, the hero continued to be a bright and hopeful light. After that day, Bill began to work hard in the forge, waiting for their return. He was a little sad when Tom disappeared, leaving only a letter and some money. But he was okay because he had to keep himself busy to make his uncle and Sepia happy. Thus the days flew by as he prepared items for Sepia and wine for Phil. Until at a certain point, with a crazed look, he wonders how many days have passed. Until one day someone knocks on the door of Bill's forge, breaking the silence. They introduce themselves as being from the Imperial House, and Bill is surprised by the visit. Without wasting time, our protagonist rushes to answer the door, all excited. He thinks he's waited a long time for this special moment to finally arrive, because he was finally going to reunite with his friend Sepia and his uncle Phil again. He plans to ask about her equipment and offer his uncle some good wine. Full of joy, Bill opens the door to welcome them. However, instead, he finds 2 coffins in the middle of a desolate field. He sees a strange version of Sepia drooling over one of the coffins, and the other was for his uncle Phil, marking the worst day of his life forever. In that instant, our protagonist's world completely fell apart. Remembering that day, he sees Oliver and asks what happened to her leg. Her spectral form seems to be in great pain and agony in that spot, non-stop, until she finally falls from the coffin and vanishes into the air like smoke. Back in the present, we see Bill with an empty, aged look from the pain. Bill wonders if he's dreaming as he sees Oliver leaning against one of the coffins. Slowly, he approaches the wooden object, not believing what he's seeing. Crying, he asks what his uncle is doing lying in there like that. After all, he had even bought an expensive drink for them to celebrate together. Suddenly, our protagonist starts laughing in a completely uncontrollable way. But the laughter soon turns into a scream of pain and despair that echoes through the place. He screams endlessly, asking why this is happening to him. In an act of madness, Bill starts shaking the coffin, begging him to wake up. It was a pain so intense it felt like his own flesh was being torn apart. At that moment, he remembers Oliver's lie about Sepia's mission. The memory of that false promise gave a new direction to his growing rage. He also recalls the empty promise that the hero would help his uncle come back. And so, all his fury finally found a target to be unleashed upon. Kneeling on the ground, he lets out one last scream of pure anguish and hatred. His eyes glow with power as his pain now had a place to land. The scene flashes back to the past when Oliver says goodbye to our protagonist. He hands a golden emblem to Bill as proof that he was his guest. Oliver says that with it, he could visit the castle or even sell it at the market. The hero even jokes, saying the object is made of pure gold and is worth a lot of money. Bill holds the emblem with gratitude and promises that one day he will repay the favor. Little did he know that this repayment would be in a very different way than expected. In the present, Bill uses the emblem to enter the castle, and the guard recognizes him immediately. With a cold look, he says he's come to perform maintenance on the Lord Protector's sword. The guard then asks him to wait while he informs his superiors of the visit. While waiting, Bill grips his case tightly, showing all his tension. He then starts to imagine how he could defeat the hero in a direct fight. In his mind, Bill charges straight at Oliver in a desperate attack. But he knows that the chances of defeating the strongest man in the world are minimal. In fact, his probability of success was exactly 0%, because in his imagination, he is easily defeated and called a rat by the hero. After all, our protagonist is a blacksmith, not a real warrior. Besides, the hero has the strongest sword in existence, and it would be impossible to beat him. That's why he thought long and hard, and the answer to his revenge was quite simple. It was something only a blacksmith could do, and that no one would ever suspect. His plan was simply to use his repair craft to his advantage. After all, a blacksmith fixing a weapon is the most normal thing in the world. In this way, Oliver let his guard down completely, without any suspicion. And so, the most powerful weapon ended up in the hands of our protagonist. With the world's strongest man defenseless, Bill thought his plan was brilliant. He then asks if he should use the hammer or the hero's own sword. Annoyed, Bill yells at him to answer, but Oliver says he never wanted to be a hero. Our protagonist gets confused and scoffs, asking if he's going to complain about his life. But Oliver explains that he became disillusioned because one person can't save everyone. Bill slams the table and says he brought peace to the world and shouldn't talk like that. Finally, the hero agrees that he did indeed save the world from destruction. However, he questions what would have happened if the Demon King's army had never invaded, and if he had never needed to save the world from that great threat. The hero then explains that the solution was quite simple from the beginning. They just needed to be so powerful that no one would dare challenge them. So if the country were strong enough, the war would never have happened. That's why after defeating the Demon King, he found the definitive answer. Bill remains silent as the hero prepares to reveal his plan. And the answer was that he himself should rule the country forever. So he eliminated the corrupt nobility and sought new talent for the empire. Oliver raises his hands and says he won't rest until no one can challenge them. He then asks if Bill understands why he was brought to that place. But our protagonist doesn't care and lunges at the hero with everything he's got. He yells that if Oliver is done talking, then it's time for him to kick the bucket. The hero is surprised by the attack but doesn't seem the least bit worried. He simply points a finger at Bill and says it's a real shame. Oliver then launches a magic arrow that pierces our protagonist's shoulder. Bill feels excruciating pain, and his body is thrown backward by the force of the attack. With the impact, the hero's sword falls to the ground, and he screams in pain from the wound. The guards rush into the room upon hearing the scream and find Bill on the floor. They ask if the Lord Protector is okay, but he says it was nothing serious. Immediately, Bill is arrested for attempted assault against Oliver Prime. Our protagonist then asks since when he knew about his revenge plan. The hero explains that was the wrong question to ask at that moment. After all, he defeated the Demon King alone, so it would be obvious he'd sense his intent. Bill is intrigued and asks what the reason was for not attacking him sooner. Oliver replies that it's simply because he is very capable and talented. He then reveals that he wanted Bill as one of his closest allies. The hero extends his hand and says the offer is still on the table for him. Bill is surrounded by guards while Oliver waits for an answer. He asks if he's serious and says he'll decide after one more question. Oliver finds it amusing but agrees to answer his question honestly. With a serious look, our protagonist asks what happened to Sepia. He wants to know why she ended up in such a horrible and unsalvageable state. The hero then explains that she was very capable and defeated 200,000 demons. But in the final battle against the Demon King, she ended up losing her leg. Even so, she didn't despair, and they managed to defeat the great evil. Thus, peace finally returned to the world after a long and hard war. However, this peace was short-lived, and humanity began to fight amongst themselves. With the kingdom's power weakened, even the heroes went to the front lines. It turns out Sepia was the only one left behind, in a wheelchair. She felt useless and lonely while all her friends were fighting. Consumed by loneliness, she drank until she collapsed on the floor from sadness. So she resorted to something forbidden to become useful again. Using dark magic, she managed to return to the battlefield once more. Finally, Oliver says that Bill has already seen the side effects of this dark power. The hero then asks if Bill has his answer to the proposal. But our protagonist ignores him and says he still hasn't answered his question. He then questions why Oliver didn't stay by her side to help her. After all, she was his comrade, and he let her get into that pitiful state. Bill yells that she lost her leg fighting alongside him to save the world. Besides, as Lord Protector, he had the power and influence to have helped her. The memory of a happy running Sepia comes to his mind like a stab in the gut. He then says that she needed him more than anything else. Our protagonist doubles over in pain and asks, so what? To the whole story, Oliver then questions if he's trying to shift the responsibility onto him. He yells that if Bill was so worried, why didn't he go and help her himself? After all, while he was saving the world, our protagonist was safe in the forge. Oliver then points at him and yells, "How dare you lecture me?" The hero then calls him a coward for running away from his responsibilities. Finally, he falls silent, waiting for a response from our protagonist. Oliver starts to laugh mockingly and repeats the word coward. Suddenly, he turns around with a crazed, hateful look on his face. With a swift movement, he cuts off our protagonist's arm. Bill is in shock, staring at the spot where his limb should be. The hero then yells that he has no responsibility for something that is useless to him. He says he spared his life in recognition of his past services. Bill's severed arm falls to the floor in a pool of blood and pain. Our protagonist screams with all his might as Oliver walks away. The hero then leaves, leaving Bill behind to suffer with his loss. Sometime later, we see Bill's old forge, which is now abandoned. Someone knocks on the door asking if anyone is home. The person waits for a response, but the house remains completely silent. Suddenly, the door opens and Bill appears with a vacant, lifeless expression. The visitor is Sarah, a former member of the hero's party and a friend of Bill's. After hearing the whole story, she understands what happened to her friend. Sarah then jokes that the country has developed thanks to Oliver, but Bill gets annoyed. Besides, she laments having come for nothing since he can no longer work as a blacksmith. Despite his arm being in that pitiful state, he doesn't give up. He claims he can still work but refuses to make a dagger or do repairs for her. Sarah then lies down and says it's a shame because she was going to tell him the truth about Sepia. Hearing this, Bill changes his mind and says he'll do the job just this once. Satisfied with the answer, she asks how much he's going to charge for the dagger. Our protagonist replies that the price is the cost of materials and the story of Sepia. Sarah accepts the deal, and the two sit down to start their conversation. As he works, Sarah reveals that the hero twisted the whole story to his advantage. She then asks if he really thinks Sepia wouldn't have dodged the Demon King's attack. After all, Sepia was the second fastest in the group, second only to Sarah herself. She drops the ring and says the Demon King was fast, but he wasn't that strong. That was the same orichalcum ring that Bill had made for Sepia years ago. Finally, Sarah reveals that she didn't fail to dodge, she chose not to. It turns out she sacrificed herself to protect the hero from the Demon King's attack. And the reason she returned to the battlefield was completely different. In fact, it was Oliver himself who asked Sepia for help in the war. He needed to win to become the Lord Protector, but the tide was against him. However, Sepia refuses the request because she doesn't think she can be useful in her condition. She then shows her leg and says she can't do anything to help him. The hero approaches and tells her not to worry about that little detail. He then shows her a grimoire they found in demon territory. Sepia is shocked because it was a book of forbidden dark magic. She tries to argue that such power shouldn't be used by anyone. Oliver clenches his fists and doesn't seem to like her answer very much. He then flips out and throws the book at her in a rage. The hero yells that they are comrades and she can't refuse his request. Oliver then approaches and starts giving a speech about their relationship. He says he thought of her as more than just a simple battle companion. Sepia is completely speechless at Oliver's sudden declaration. He then realizes what he said and pretends it was a slip up to cover his tracks. The hero apologizes and asks her to forget what happened that day. But as he walks away, Sepia remains silent, thinking about her decision. She then calls out to him and asks him to wait a moment before leaving. With a determined expression, Sepia looks at Oliver and makes her decision. Seeing this, the hero flashes a malicious grin because his plan worked. Sarah, who was hiding and observing everything, heard Sepia accept the proposal. Suddenly, Sepia is startled by something and drops an object on the floor. It was the orichalcum ring that Bill had made for her with so much care. The ring rolls across the floor until it stops near the foot of a familiar person. It was Bill, who was watching the scene from afar and now understood everything. He then approaches and asks to see Sepia's hand for a moment. Not understanding, she shows him her hand, and he places the ring on her finger. Finally, Bill says that this way she won't lose the ring again and walks away. Back in the present, Bill tries to pick up the ring, but something stops him. The ring he himself had forged now rejected him as if it didn't know him. Our protagonist finds it strange because the ring no longer fits his finger. He remembers when he made it to fit Sepia's hand perfectly, but now the object seems to have shrunk and won't go on at all. Suddenly, he drops the ring and starts to feel very sick. Bill then falls to the ground and wonders why this is happening. Tears begin to stream from his eyes and fall onto the dirt floor. He then clenches his fist tightly and begins to cry out of anger and pain. All his suffering explodes in a scream of anguish and despair. He then punches the ground with force, showing all his frustration. Lying on the floor, he wonders where it all started to go wrong in his life. He questions if it was when he took on an apprentice in his forge, or maybe when he let Sepia leave without trying to stop her. Finally, he wonders if the mistake was giving the sword to the hero. Bill thinks that everything he did only served to prove how weak he was. He feels completely powerless, lying on the ground with no strength to get up. Suddenly, he has a vision of a woman smiling gently at him. It was Sepia, who approaches him and touches his face with care and affection. Tears stream from his eyes, and he wonders what is happening. He then questions if she is trying to comfort him after everything. He feels guilty because he never did anything for her when she needed it most. Determined to change his fate, Bill picks up his hammer with his remaining hand. He then promises Sepia that he will fix all his mistakes. With a powerful blow, he begins to forge a new weapon with all his might. His body fills with energy as he works non-stop in the forge. He promises he will fix everything, no matter what happens from now on. And just like that, an intense glow fills the place, showing his reborn power. Sarah then says goodbye and says she'll be back in 2 weeks to pick up the dagger. Finally, she confesses that she also feels guilty for not stopping Oliver. Bill listens in silence as she prepares to leave. Then she says that if he needs help, he just has to call her. She promises she'll help him at least once and then leaves. Sometime later, a great explosion of light occurs in the forge. Our protagonist, now with a metal arm, vows that his revenge will be absolute. The scene then shifts to a group of students running through the forest. The leader asks Hans to explain the day's mission to the rest of the group. Hans then says they've received reports of explosions near a village. The leader likes the answer, and Hans continues to explain the situation. He then tells the students to focus on investigating, not fighting. Everyone agrees, and the group spreads out to begin the investigation. They soon arrive at the site of the explosions and start looking for clues. One of the students notices there's no smell of gunpowder in the air. Another student notes that the sawdust is recent, and the culprit can't be far. Finally, a girl asks about the possibility of teleportation magic. Hans explains that the place is too close to the village to use escape magic. The leader praises the group's analysis and says they're on the right track. Suddenly, something catches their attention, and the group spreads out to investigate. They hide in the trees and watch what's happening on the scene. And what they find is our protagonist training with a sword. He seems to be having some difficulty handling the weapon with just one hand. Bill continues to practice his moves a bit clumsily. Tired, he stops for a moment and complains that the target is just a rookie swordsman. He looks up and laments as he was hoping for a powerful mage. Hans says his combat skill is that of a common thug. The girl agrees and says it won't take all three of them to deal with him. The other student also agrees and gets ready for a surprise attack. Hans then asks if the mission has changed from reconnaissance to capture. The leader explains that he can't label him a criminal without proof, but then he pulls out a wanted poster with our protagonist's face on it. He reads that Bill is a blacksmith and has many special notes. The leader is shocked to see that he's accused of attempting to attack the Lord Protector. He then shouts for Group A to prepare for a capture mission. The leader warns that capture is preferable, but they know what that means. One of the students understands that if the capture fails, they can take out the target. Hans realizes that if he tried to attack the Lord Protector, then he must be very strong. The girl prepares herself and says they should attack with everything they've got from the start. And so, the three students charge at our protagonist with everything they have. With a coordinated attack, they easily knock Bill to the ground. Our protagonist is surprised and doesn't understand what just happened. Hans is confused by his weakness and doubts that he's the criminal. They then consider that he might just be some informant for the group. Hans gets thoughtful, trying to understand the situation and what to do next. He then approaches and throws Bill's sword near him on the ground. Finally, he tells Bill to fight and meet his end like a swordsman. With an arrogant smile, Hans says this is a kindness from the next hero, himself. Hearing that, Bill gives him a dirty look, clearly not appreciating the kid's attitude. Then our protagonist picks up his sword and says the boy has it all wrong. Since they attacked him out of nowhere, Bill decides talking is no longer an option. With a smirk, he tells the student to pay attention because he's about to show him how to use a sword. First, he explains how to measure the distance between you and your opponent before attacking. Next, our protagonist easily dodges the student's strike, showing his agility. With a quick step, Bill prepares to counter-attack the young swordsman, and in a single motion, he lunges at Hans with absurd speed. The student is in shock because he couldn't even see the sword coming near his neck. Bill continues his lesson, explaining how the motion of the strike should not be broken. Immediately after, he demonstrates his skill once more with a powerful attack. Taking another quick step, he gets even closer to his opponent on the field, and he finishes the move, hitting the boy squarely with the flat of his sword. Finally, Hans feels the impact and screams in pain as he's hit by the blacksmith's attack. With the force of the blow, the student Hans is thrown far across the battlefield. Lying on the ground, he hears our protagonist say his performance was pathetic. With a dark look, Bill asks how he's going to compensate for all the wasted time. Meanwhile, the group's leader finds the whole situation very strange. After all, their mission was to investigate the explosions they heard near the village, and from the destroyed trees and rocks, they were sure there had been explosions. That's why they deduced the culprit was a mage or someone with bombs. But all they found was a rookie swordsman with no scent of gunpowder or mana. On the ground, Hans begs for our protagonist to stop it already. However, Bill just asks what he wants him to stop and continues the attack. The leader then realizes that if there's no one else, Bill's weapon must be something else entirely. Desperate, Hans holds out his hand and tells them to just get it over with, because Bill's weapon wasn't a sword, but something more like a cannon. Suddenly a huge explosion of red energy erupts and hits the student, and we see an image of a hand with chains breaking under all that power. Screaming in pain, Bill clutches his arm while the leader calls him a coward for hiding his weapon. It turns out the chains on his metal arm break from the power of the explosion. Our protagonist then realizes what happened to his left arm after the attack. He then questions what kind of swordsman drops his own sword on the ground like that. On the ground, Hans still scoffs and wonders if Bill can even be called a swordsman anymore. Hearing this, our protagonist becomes furious with the student's comment. He then promises to cut off the kid's mouth along with the rest of him. Completely desperate, Hans closes his eyes and tries to protect himself from the final blow. But the swords clash in mid-air before hitting the target on the battlefield. It turns out the group leader stepped in and stopped Bill's attack just in time. Our protagonist shouts the man's name, surprised by his sudden intervention. The leader then compliments Bill's strategy, as it was really good against them. He had enough destructive power to finish off his target in one go. However, at the most critical moment of the fight, the young apprentice hesitated, because he ended up closing his eyes in fear and missed the chance to attack Bill. The leader explains that this moment of hesitation shows that Hans has never taken a life before. He also says that no matter how much they try to attack you, taking a life is never easy. One of the students complains that Hans was almost defeated, but the leader tells the boy to shut up. Then the leader tells everyone to be quiet and look carefully at our protagonist. He then questions if Bill really seems like a good training partner for them. Bill yells that they can't just take him, and that they should use the opportunity to train. However, the leader says that from the beginning, Bill showed no hostility towards them. And without that hostility, they can't fight seriously, and our protagonist agrees. So, the leader orders Squad 3 of Group A to get their training talismans. Hans is very confused, not understanding what these talismans are for. The leader calls the criminal Bill and asks if he's familiar with the Hero Academy's curriculum. He explains that one of the mandatory programs is to train students to attack evil without hesitation. To do this, they use a live criminal for the students to get used to the blood and screams. The other students find the name Bill Bark familiar and remember something very important. It turns out the name on their practice assignment was Phil Bark, not our protagonists. Realizing they're talking about his family, Bill lets out a scream of pure rage. The group leader then confirms our protagonist's suspicion with a serious look. However, he notices that Bill's determination isn't quite complete yet, because the leader sees that our protagonist is still suffering and isn't ready to fight. Suddenly, Bill clenches his fist as he finally understands what he needs to do. He looks at the students and thinks that to defeat Oliver, he needs to do something drastic. It turns out he needs to erase everything the hero created, including those students. With an insane smile and tears in his eyes, he accepts his new dark objective. Then our protagonist stands up and asks them to wait a moment before attacking. He then asks if they need a real combat training target. Bill says he's a blacksmith, and fighting like this won't be good training for the group. Not understanding, the leader questions what he's trying to say with all this. Our protagonist then replies that he just needs a little time. He asks for some time to arm himself and promises he'll do his best to defeat them. However, the other students think he just wants to run away and ask the leader to finish him off. Our protagonist repeats the words "run away" with scorn and contempt. He then questions if they really think he would escape. With a wary sigh, Bill seems to have accepted his fate. Suddenly, he breaks into an insane smile and confirms he's not going anywhere. Seeing his determination, the leader agrees to the young man's proposal. He then asks how much time our protagonist needs to prepare. Bill replies that 1 hour is enough, and the leader tells him to get going. However, he warns that Bill already knows what will happen if he's late. One of the students jokes that he'll feed his remains to the pigs. He then holds up a piece of meat to reinforce his lame joke. Time passes and the boy insists that our protagonist has fled. The girl complains about the lost credit, but the leader tells them to wait a little longer. Completely bored, the girl stretches from all the waiting. Suddenly, a metal hand appears from the sky, heading towards the student. The object is caught in mid-air, and the girl is left clueless about what just happened. Immediately after, a large fiery explosion occurs in the middle of the battlefield, and amidst the smoke a metal hand forms and grabs the object in the air. The girl screams in desperation as the metal arm flies towards her with a chain. Right after, Bill appears in a full, imposing suit of armor on the scene. With a glowing blue eye, he says that now there are only 35 fingers left. Furious, the student yells at the others to finish Bill off in the most painful way possible. The other two students then charge at our protagonist with everything they've got. They try a combined attack, but Bill doesn't seem to care in the slightest. With a serious look, our protagonist prepares for a real fight against the group. He then draws a sword and gets into a combat stance against the young students. The leader then asks what one does against an enemy with such heavy armor. He answers his own question, the targets are the joints, and one of the students goes on the attack. The boy manages to land a blow near the joint of our protagonist's armor. Because the joints that connect the armor are made of fabric or very thin chains, so they continue to relentlessly attack the weak points of Bill's armor. However, not even at the joints can the sword pierce his armor. The student is in shock as he didn't expect this much resistance. Annoyed, the girl shouts that playtime is over and charges forward. She yells for him to kick the bucket with all her strength in the attack. Then she throws a small energy sphere towards our protagonist. But Bill says she has a soft heart for not attacking for real, because even in this situation, she aimed for his hand and not his head. The leader calls her a fool for still holding back on the final blow. Furious at the comment, the girl curses at our protagonist. The leader then says that his students, on the other hand, don't hold back at all. And with a combined attack, they manage to knock Bill to the ground. One of the students then stomps on his back with full force. The leader orders them to step on him to immobilize him for good on the ground. Thus, they begin to stomp relentlessly on our protagonist's armor. But they wonder if the blows are having any effect on him. One of the students then tells them to break the joints of Bill's armor. However, our protagonist scoffs, because future heroes shouldn't fight 3 against 1. But the boy says that doesn't matter and continues the attack, holding him from behind. Suddenly, the girl is hit hard in the stomach and falls to the ground in pain. The other one says it's just training and for Bill not to take it personally. Our protagonist then looks at them with a gaze full of hatred and resentment. Even on the ground, the student tells him not to take it personally either. Immediately after, a strange object is forced against the girl's face. At that moment, Bill's armor begins to glow and activate a mechanism. And just like that, several metal spikes suddenly shoot out from his entire armor. The students holding him are pierced and scream in pain from the surprise attack. Bill then says that the attacks on the joints were already within his expectations. He turns to the leader and asks when he's finally going to join the fight. The leader points at him, accepting the challenge and preparing for combat. And so, the other students charge at our protagonist with everything they have. Annoyed, Bill prepares for combat against the academy students. However, they are very agile and easily dodge all his attacks. Bill tries to hit them again, but the student leaps over him in the air. Frustrated, our protagonist complains that his sword can't reach them. He then wonders how he'll get his revenge if he can't even hit a student. After all, he questions how his sword will one day reach the hero Oliver. Despite this, he calms himself and tells himself not to be hasty. With his eyes glowing, he thinks that the fight is like forging steel in the forge. Because you don't get what you want with just a single hammer strike on the metal. You have to strike once, and then again with all your strength on the steel. And one more time, until the metal finally begins to take the desired shape. He then continues to fight and defend against the attacks without stopping for a second. His sword begins to glow intensely with power accumulated from the blows. Our protagonist holds the weapon firmly, waiting for the right moment to strike. Until finally he lands a blow that creates a huge shockwave in the area. The student complains that it was just a lucky scratch and no big deal. Then the other boy asks Hans and Lin how they should finish the fight. However, Bill says he has an idea to end this once and for all. Immediately after, he fires several objects from his armor towards the group. The objects fly quickly and spread across the battlefield to surround the students. Suddenly, the objects turn into a net that traps Lin, and she can't get out. Our protagonist then says that not even the strength of an ogre could break that net. The other student yells that if they don't get back in time, the academy will send reinforcements. With a smile, he says that time is on their side and Bill doesn't stand a chance. But Bill cuts the net easily and asks if he thought he hadn't considered that. He then questions if they know the reason he only activated the trap now. It turns out Bill needed some combat training too, and thanks them for their help. The student begs not to be attacked, but Bill says he'll start by collecting fingers. Desperate, the boy yells for Bill to get his hand away from him immediately. Finally, he screams for help from his leader, who is watching from a distance. But the leader just says that the student passed the test, ignoring his plea. And immediately after, the boy is silenced with a swift and precise blow. Blood splatters all over Bill's armor, who just watches the scene. Then the leader turns to our protagonist and says that he also passed the test. With an insane smile, he congratulates Bill on his excellent performance in the fight. It turns out that now all the other students are also caught in the net. Lin lets out a scream of pure terror upon seeing what happened to her colleagues. The other boy calls Bill crazy, not understanding what's happening. However, he is attacked from behind by his own leader, who ignores him. The student is completely in shock, unable to believe his master's betrayal. And so, the leader ends the lives of his own students without mercy. He then tells them all to finally rest in peace. Furthermore, he hopes they are reborn into a world with better adults. Bill remains in a defensive stance, not lowering his sword for even a second. Finally, the leader tells him not to be so defensive, as the fight is already over. The leader repeats that he passed the test, while our protagonist remains on the ground. Bill is in shock, because he couldn't see anything that happened there. He then wonders why the master attacked his own students like that. And he also thinks about how he should fight a monster like that. Even so, he prepares for combat as the fight is not yet over. The leader says there was a misunderstanding and that the kids deserved that end. However, he says it was better to end it all without causing them more pain. His eyes show a strange and frightening conviction in his words. Then he charges at Bill with a swift and very powerful strike. Lying on the ground, the leader says he was already expecting that attack pattern. Bill attacks him again, but the man asks him to listen to what he has to say. It turns out he came here specifically to find our protagonist. He then asks if Bill hates the Lord Protector, the hero Oliver Prime, because the leader feels the same way and traps Bill with a surprise attack. Finally, he says they can talk to sort things out once and for all. The leader stares at Bill with a serious look, as his patience has run out. Even so, our protagonist doesn't seem to be listening and extends a hand, panting. Then the man says there's no other way, and a bright light shines in the place. He approaches and says that Bill himself brought this terrible fate upon himself. Next, he delivers a powerful blow that sends blood flying everywhere. The scene then cuts to Hans, who wakes up screaming from a horrible nightmare. He finds himself in an unknown room, lying on a wooden bed. The boy touches his own face and wonders if he's still really alive. He wonders where he is and where his armor is, and remembers the North Passage. Besides, he finds it strange because the passage was fine just a few days ago. Suspicious of everything, he grabs a small knife that was on the table beside him. Hans opens the door and notices the wind has changed and started to leave tracks. With the knife in hand, he walks carefully, knowing it could be dangerous. Then the student peeks through a crack to see what's happening outside. And he sees Bill with a group of people while someone asks about the key. A man named Varun compliments Bill's control of force while talking to a young man. Meanwhile, another man drinks nonstop and asks Draco to bring more booze. A young man offers a sweet to a girl who starts crying with joy. The girl is enchanted by the gift and holds it tenderly in her hands. Seeing the scene, Hans is in shock and clutches the knife, because that was Sepia. Suddenly, he hears someone say that he's awake and is surprised from behind. His eyes widen in fear as he realizes he's been discovered. Without a second thought, Hans attacks the person with the knife in a desperate blow. The group is startled by the commotion and shouts for their boss, who was attacked. But Bill just says he's fine and tells everyone to sit back down. With a smile, he says he managed to block the blow, but the knife went through him. Annoyed, the red-haired boy asks if Hans wants to get hurt and doesn't know who the boss is. Then Bill calms him down and says he must be confused and scared by everything. He then asks if Hans forgives him for bringing Sepia without his permission. Finally, the leader introduces himself as Wat Tyler and gets straight to the point with Hans. Bill then invites Hans to join his group to take down the Lord Protector. Hans repeats the question, and the leader says his skills would be a great help. However, our protagonist refuses the offer on the spot without a second thought, because his only goal in life is to finish off the Lord Protector with his own hands. Bill listens with a smile and says he understands his reasons for revenge, but he explains that taking down someone with absolute power won't be easy. So Hans proposes that they work together just until they take down the hero Oliver. He also says that after that, our protagonist is free to do whatever he wants. Everyone in the group looks at Bill, waiting for an answer to the proposal. But our protagonist slaps Hans' hand with great force and anger. He then wonders if he should cooperate with the people who hurt his uncle. With a look full of hatred, he tells everyone to leave before he attacks them. The other boy says it was a misunderstanding, but Bill completely ignores him. The leader then approaches and questions if revenge alone will be enough. Hans then tries to argue, but Bill cuts him off before he can speak. And he also asks if Bill is confident enough to face the hero alone. Our protagonist trembles and says he needs to do it with his own hands. Blood drips from his hand as the pain of loss consumes him from within. He then lets out a cry of pain and falls to the ground in complete despair. On his knees, Bill wonders what he should do to get his revenge. He laments losing his arm, his hand, Sepia, and also his uncle Phil. The other boy then says that's enough and that Bill has gotten his point. A young man approaches and says it's a pleasure to finally meet him up close. Our protagonist looks at the young man, not understanding anything that's happening. He then wonders what happened to the fingers of the young man in front of him. The young man introduces himself as Edric and suggests that Bill hear the rest of the story. The scene then shifts to a prison with various weapons scattered on the floor. A guard yells for the prisoners to grab their weapons for combat. A man announces that whoever defeats the count in combat will have their freedom. But one of the prisoners says they are common people. and don't know how to fight. He says he just wanted their voices to be heard, but the Count doesn't seem to care. Ignoring the plea, the man orders the hostages, who were in chains, to be brought in, and to the prisoners' despair, they see their own family members as hostages. The Count then stands up and says he only respects his companions because they are strong. Furthermore, he reveals that before they took up arms, they were no different from the prisoners. They were just farmers, carpenters, and merchants, but he doesn't care about the past. Then the Count says that if they can't fight for themselves, he'll give them a reason to fight, and harasses one of the female hostages in front of everyone. Desperate, her husband charges at the Count to protect his wife. However, the man uses the woman as a human shield to protect himself from the attack. The young man is in shock because his wife is in front of him as a hostage. Without hesitation, the Count stabs the woman through the back in front of her husband. With his weapon stained, he asks why the others are just standing there doing nothing. He even questions if he needs to help them again for them to fight. Finally, consumed by hatred, the prisoners rush to attack the Count with everything they have. The Count watches the prisoners run towards him without showing any reaction. He then throws his weapon into the air and prepares for a real fight. In the blink of an eye, a bloodbath ensues and everyone is defeated. Finally, the man says that weakness is a sin, and that is why they all perished.